Good evening. Thank you for joining us today for this timely conversation about one of the most beautiful and significant architectural landmarks in the world, the Cathedral of Notre-Dame in Paris, which has just reopened a few days ago after the devastating fire in April of 2019. My name is Anne Lester, and I'm the John W. Baldwin and Jenny Jochens Associate Professor of Medieval History at the Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences. I'm very pleased to be here with you this evening and to host and moderate this virtual discussion on the cathedral's rich 900-year history with Kathy Borrus, a Hopkins alumna and author of a new book, Notre-Dame de Paris, The Celebration of the Cathedral. In addition, she is the author of multiple books, including 500 Buildings of Paris, 1,000 Buildings of Paris, The Fearless Shopper, and Stubby, a children's picture book. Kathy's writing has also appeared in the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, Fitz, Starts, and Matters of the Heart, Art Business News, and France Guide, among many other places. So before I turn things over to Kathy, I just want to remind everyone tuning in live to please use the chat feature below in the live stream there to leave comments and ask questions. And we'll be monitoring the conversation as we go along, and we'll do our best at the end to respond to as many questions as we can during the Q&A towards the very end of our broadcast. So without further ado, I'm thrilled to turn things over to Kathy.
Good evening, everyone, or as they say in Paris, bonsoir. Despite the background, I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., and taking you on a journey through time. It's been 5 years since the fire. I just want to thank Anne again for that lovely introduction, and for Joe and Patrick for their tech support, and Erin, who's tuning in, for asking me to talk about it. So I'm going to talk a bit about how I came to write Notre-Dame de Paris, the book's organization, my research, and the stories that fascinated me about some of the images and objects. The subtitle pretty much sums up the book. It is indeed a celebration of the cathedral and its ingenious Gothic engineering and the central role in Paris's religious, political, and cultural life. It's also, by the way, ground zero from which every distance in France is measured. So about a week after the fire, and a week before I was planning to spend a month in Paris, I got a call from the editor of my Paris books. And these books were, the 1,000 Buildings of Paris was the first book. It's all about the architecture, the history, or just a good story about each of the 1,000 buildings. And then about 10 years later, they wanted to turn the Paris book, and they have one on London and New York, into paperback, and they called them 500 Buildings of Paris. So when the editor called me and said they wanted to do a celebration of the cathedral, I thought, okay, what do I know about Notre Dame? In college, I climbed to the top, and I immediately, but that was the last time I was there, because there's always crowded with tourist buses and tourists. So I immediately read the long paragraph that I had in the 1,000 Building books, but of course, that was certainly not long enough to write a book. So the editor said they wanted text, historic and cultural, about 60 to 100 images and descriptive text for each of the images through the century. And I said, sure. But the hitch was they wanted the book out in the fall. And this was April 2019. So I had about 5 weeks to research and write the book. Needless to say, with that kind of deadline, I didn't get much sleep. I read absolutely everything I could, wrote a 5-page introduction the week before I left for Paris, starting with the fire and going back into its history and construction and the central role it's played both religiously and secularly through the almost 900 centuries. And here, Victor Hugo's quote is very apt. It's true of so many buildings in Paris, as I discovered writing First 1,000 Buildings of Paris book for various reasons. Money ran out, fundraising was tough, inclement weather stopped construction. Often in the case of Notre-Dame, flooding of the Seine became a problem. And as many of you probably know, it took nearly 2 centuries before the cathedral was totally complete. It was the work of master builders and stonemasons. There was no architect attached to the project. So the buildings organization, this first section defines common Gothic cathedral features, definitions, descriptions, stories of its portal, statuary, the western facade, which you're looking at here, and various decorative elements. And the next few slides give you a sampling of this section. And this is the schematic of the building and the interior cutaway. It's a very useful section for understanding the parts of a Gothic cathedral and how it's organized, followed by descriptions. Here's one of the images. You're looking at the western facade and the Virgin's balcony. It's on the 3rd level above the Gallery of Kings, which is right here, and the 3 entry portals. It's dedicated, the rose window, the immense rose window is 33 feet across and dedicated to the Virgin Mary, which is why there's a statue in the middle and she is flanked by 2 angels. And other images are described in the book as well, and the intricate carvings. One of my favorite images is the chimera or gargoyle. Which are they? The names are often used interchangeably, but both are carved mythical beasts thought to ward off evil, yet at the same time inspire a religious fear of hell, and hence their other name, the grotesques. But there is a difference. A gargoyle has a practical use. You can see them here. They are water spouts to drain off the rain from the top of the cathedral. And the chimeras are only decorative. They look out over Paris from along the top of the colonnade of the north and south towers. They were actually added in mid-19th century. So much of the cathedral is actually not Gothic, but 19th century recreations, which I'll get to that. Anyway, about 54 stone creatures live on the roof. Some have names, some do not. This one is probably the most famous, the Shrans. I have trouble pronouncing that name. In classical mythology, this creature was a large, beak, shape-shifting bird that occasionally fed on human flesh. But I have to say, this one looks more brooding and pensive, bored even, certainly more contemplative than carnivorous, but it is the most famous, and you'll see it depicted in various photographic images. So the next section has to do with the history, and this is a detail of a famous Delacroix painting. It depicts liberty leading the people and the 1830 July Revolution. Well, why is it here? If you look very closely in the right-hand section, there are the twin towers of Notre-Dame cutting through the fog of revolution and watching history unfold. In fact, the history of Notre-Dame is one of continual construction, renovation, revision, destruction, restoration, alteration, and renewal. It's an ever-changing landscape, both the architecture and its storied past. Just a little aside, this was one of my first confrontations with the editor of the book, who said in the copy something like, well, Notre-Dame dominates the scene. And I said to him, you can't possibly say that. You could even, it's liberty. leading the people that dominates, and there's the little tiny towers. So I won that editorial debate. I lost another one later on, which I'll show you. But this section takes you in images and text from Notre Dame's inception through the 21st century as witness to all the major events: revolutions, wars, coronations, liberations, marriages. This is depicting, obviously, the cornerstone, 1163. Notre Dame was the brainchild of Bishop Maurice de Sully, who really wanted to make a statement and mark Paris as a major capital of the world. He came up with this idea in 1160, and 3 years later, with the backing of King Louis VII, Pope Alexander III laid the cornerstone on a bedrock of limestone on Ile de la Cité. And then the fundraising began. By the time of Bishop de Sully's death in 1197, construction on the foundation, the nave, the aisles, and the transept had begun. But it was never completed in his lifetime, though he clearly had a vision that it would be a lasting monument. It was eventually completed in 1345, and continuous renovations and replacements over the following century up to the fire took place, which is kind of ironic that there was such a hue and cry about rebuilding Notre Dame exactly as it was after the fire, because in fact, it was ever changing. So in this section, there are all sorts of other things. Here is an illuminated manuscript of Saint Ginevra from 1430. Here she is atop in the red cape, atop the twin towers of Notre Dame. It's interesting that she was the patron saint, or is the patron saint of Paris from the 5th century, not medieval Paris. But it's very interesting. The manuscript gives you an idea of what a medieval warrant that Paris was in the 15th century, a crowded cluster of alleys and buildings. This image is Marie Antoinette and the buildings of the French Revolution. I am, by the way, skipping a few decades to come up with some of these slides because we only have about 40 minutes. This event took place in 1781. Marie Antoinette was 25 years old. She is in the center of this, dressed very fashionably with her entourage in the interior of Notre Dame, giving thanks for the birth of her son and would-be heir to the throne. She was very popular at first, but then she was blamed for the financial crisis and nicknamed Madame Deficit. Her phrase, "let them eat cake," was probably "let them eat brioche." But she had a lavish lifestyle that did not endear her to her subjects, especially when her subjects were experiencing famine and a bread shortage. And then 12 years later, she was beheaded. This etching is unsigned and undated, but it's by Jean-Michel Moreau. He was a draftsman and engraver to the king. So the Revolution and the Gallery of the Kings, another one of my favorite stories. And during the Revolution, the revolutionaries just totally desecrated Notre Dame. They threw out all the religious objects, and you can see across the western facade the kings of Judea, but the revolutionaries mistook them for the kings of France and promptly beheaded them all. They also melted all but one of the bells to turn them into cannon fire. They knocked down the spire. They turned Notre Dame into a food and wine warehouse, a temple of reason dedicated to liberté, equalité, and fraternité. An interesting side note is in 1977, while workers were restoring a bank in a totally different neighborhood in the 9th arrondissement, the workers unearthed 21 of the 28 kings with their heads beside them. I'm going to show you a close-up, just a close-up of the gallery of the kings. And all of the ones that they unearthed are now in the Cluny Museum. But all the front now, they're 19th century reproductions. So this image shows a double coronation of Napoleon Bonaparte and his wife Josephine in 1804. Here's Napoleon. He's already been crowned. Napoleon was politically astute and wanted to curry favor with the French Catholics. So he brokered a deal with the Catholic Church in 1801 to have Notre-Dame be the center of Catholicism in Paris. But he left himself in charge of church and state. In this famous depiction by Jacques-Louis David, Napoleon, who had already been crowned, and you can see the wreath, a golden wreath of Rome, he is crowning Josephine Empress. The interesting thing about this, about the artist, David, he basically changed his political views with the prevailing winds. Sounds like something in the present day. But he was first for the revolutionaries and had been imprisoned, and then switched his allegiance to Napoleon and the powers that be. So we're going to skip a couple of decades. Notre-Dame was in terrible condition because of all the revolutionary destruction and weather damage. And in fact, it was almost sold. So who saved Notre-Dame? Well, in 1831, Victor Hugo published Notre-Dame de Paris, which Hollywood turned into The Hunchback of Notre Dame. It's one of the books I read as I was researching, and it proved absolutely invaluable. Not only did Victor Hugo recreate the ambience of life in Paris in the Middle Ages, but he also devoted multiple chapters to the architecture of Notre Dame. He was a big fan of medieval architecture. Among other musings, he referred to it as a vast symphony in stone, and he lamented its precarious condition. Well, critics dismissed the novel, thought it was terrible, but the public loved it. It was wildly popular and was reprinted several times in the 1830s, resulting in an arts commission established to save Notre Dame, and they had a competition to renovate Notre Dame. So the second person who really saved Notre Dame was Viollet-le-Duc. He and his partner, Jean-Baptiste Lassus, won the competition. They started modestly, but plans grew grander and more ambitious. Of course, there were conflicts, as there always are, between the establishment and the innovators. Among the renovations they did plan were to restore the western facade, replace the damaged sculpture, update the flying buttresses, add gargoyles and chimeras, and replace the previous spire. He made it much taller. Construction started in 1845 and went on for about 25 years. And because his partner, Lassus, died during restoration, most of the credit goes to Viollet-le-Duc. His plans then became even more ambitious and creative. And thanks to Google, I was actually able to find a book in French online that Viollet-le-Duc wrote in the 19th century about Notre Dame's construction, his own research and the renovation that he did. And he did extensive research into the medieval structure and design of absolutely every element he was adding or replacing. And with the spire, you can see the construction of it here, he was very concerned with the effects of wind on the stability of the spire, and he made it higher than the original one. And as an aside, I think that Viollet-le-Duc was a visionary genius. His idea was not to mindlessly recreate an exact replica, but to use the best materials and innovative engineering technology available at the time. And he wrote, "To restore a building is not to preserve it, to repair or to rebuild it. It is to reinstate it in a condition of completeness, which could never have existed at any given time. And though he was quite innovative, he was very faithful to the spirit of Gothic engineering. So, as I said, there's images from just about every decade. We're going to skip a few. It's a sampling of the rest of the history section and takes you through the major and minor historical events in daily life in each of the 20th and early 21st century. And Notre Dame is the obvious focus here, but you get a sense of early morning in Paris. Color photography developed in the latter part of the 1880s in experimental phases. So what you're looking at here with the soft hues in the photo, and they indicate the photographer either used a filter or more likely black and white and then hand tinted. Moving up to World War I, Paris was the target of German bombs, and the French authorities ordered protective barriers around heritage sites. And here you can see the sandbags. This is piled up in front of the three portals of Notre Dame. And it's remarkable that Notre Dame survived with very little damage in World War I. And then coming to World War II, this is a famous image by Robert Doisneau. And you can see faintly Notre Dame is in the background here. And it shows the resistant fighters, the French forces of the interior, which were about 20,000 men and women who fought off retreating Germans for control of Paris as the Allies were advancing on Paris. The battle lasted 6 days from August 19, 1944 to August 25th, when the Germans finally surrendered. And we're not sure if this resistant fighter was actually staged by Doisneau or he was, in fact, fighting at that moment. Skipping a few more decades. This is from 1971, when 20-year-old Philippe Petit enthralled crowds, balancing between the north and south towers of Notre Dame. It was his first of his high wire acts, and police never actually figured out how he gained access to the rooftop, but they suspect he snuck into the cathedral the night before and rigged a thin cable wire across the towers, which is right there, which you can't really see in this, but and then he danced and juggled his way from one tower to the next, and he did all this 225 feet above the ground. So as I mentioned, all sorts of cultural events besides religious events took place in front of Notre Dame. Tragic events as well as celebrations, and many of you may remember the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine where 12 people were killed. So this is just a memorial in front of Notre Dame for them. A lot of the treasures actually survived the fire. And what you're looking at here under the cross is the crown of thorns. It's one of the oldest and most treasured of the objects and has quite a storied past. It's 8 inches in diameter, shaped like a wreath. It's supposedly worn by Jesus during his crucifixion. It was transferred from Jerusalem to various locations. Among them, it was taken to the chapel of the Byzantine emperors in Constantinople for safekeeping and stayed there until 1238, when the then Emperor Baldwin II was running low on funds. So he gave it to a Venetian bank as collateral for a loan. And French King Louis IX, aka Saint Louis, he was cousin to Baldwin, and he assumed his debt and took ownership of the crown. It originally held 70 thorns intertwined by golden threads, all of which are missing today, unless during Reconstruction they have created replicas of it. But legend has it that King Louis handed them out as political to political friends along his journey back to Paris. And it was actually moved a lot during the French Revolution. It was moved to the Bibliothèque Nationale de France for safekeeping. And at some point, it was also in Sainte-Chapelle. But it was brought back in 1801. And since 1896, the crown has been encased in crystal and gold tubing with jeweled clasps. So this depicts the grand organ, the western side, and the rose window, both of which pretty much survived the fire. They just needed cleaning of lead dust. The first mention of the organ was in 1357, and this one is 52.5 feet above the cathedral floor, probably the most famous pipe organ with 8,000 pipes, multiple keyboards, pedals, and stops. It had been repaired and replaced multiple times over the century. It was fully restored in 1992, and then later an installation of a computer system also. And this rose window is on the western side, but there is also in the book north and south windows featured, and with it quite intricate descriptions. In the 1960s, French officials did a massive archaeological dig beneath the square in front of Notre-Dame. And one of the items they discovered was this limestone slab relief from Gallo-Roman votive pillar from the early 1st century. It represents the Vulcan Roman god of fire, kind of eerily prescient given the fire 5 years ago. It's part of the museum that they have, and many other artifacts were also unearthed during the recent renovation. And there is a link, I believe, in the comments section to an ArtNet News article explaining what they found when they did the renovation. Another one of my favorite sections is the top of Notre-Dame and the copper roof statuary. It was a Viollet-le-Duc inspiration representing apostles, the New Testament evangelists. Many of you are aware when the fire broke out, renovation had already begun on Notre-Dame, and the heads of the statues had been removed, and both the heads and the statues were airlifted to the south of France for restoration before the fire, so that they were saved and there was no damage. And I love this one, particularly on the left. It was positioned at the juncture where the roof and the spire met. It represents St. Thomas, but if you look very closely at the face, it bears a striking resemblance to Viollet-le-Duc himself. He must have amused himself with this bit of statuary immortality. The legacy of Notre-Dame through the ages, it's been a place, its places in the hearts and minds from people all over the world, and an inspiration for the various artists, writers, photographers, filmmakers, and others, including this painting by Winslow Homer in 1867, which itself was inspired by Charles Negre's earlier historic photo. And many other artists painted Notre-Dame. This one image is by Matisse, who lived nearby and painted multiple versions of Notre-Dame, as did Picasso and others. So I earlier showed this wood graving from an 1882 edition of Victor Hugo's book. He was a great admirer, as I said, of Notre-Dame, and he made Notre-Dame the silent protagonist against which the lives and loves of the major minor characters played out. This scene is from the end of the book, and spoiler alert, it depicts the fate of the evil archbishop. So Notre-Dame also inspired, as I said, many movies and characters in front of movies. There are about 4 or 5 scenes from various films. This one is Cary Grant, Audrey Hepburn in charade with Notre-Dame behind it. And this was my second disagreement with the editor, who said that Notre-Dame upstaged Grant and Hepburn. And in my opinion, nothing could ever upstage Cary Grant, or for that matter, Audrey Hepburn. So the fire and the future, all the work after the fire stopped, I heard that it took something like 11 months to just clean up the debris inside and the atmosphere all around the neighborhood. And again, there was controversy between the traditionalists and the modernists. They had quite a number of competitions. Some of them were crazy, some of them were interesting. I think if Viollet-le-Duc had been around, he would have opted for a slightly more modern, updated version. But Macron wanted it done in 5 years for the Olympics, and he got that, although it didn't open at the time of the Olympics. It just opened this past Sunday. And nobody, I think to correctly renovate it, they had to use the materials at hand and try to make it exactly as it was. But I find that interesting. Nobody asked me because it never was exactly as it was. So in summary, through the ages, Notre Dame has been a hub of daily Parisian life, a religious icon, but also a secular inspiration, influencing everything from art, literature, to music and pop culture, besides being a religious icon. It has survived wars and devastation, demonstrations and strikes, a fictional hunchback, and actual revolutionaries. It was rebuilt as it has been many times before, and it will emerge with a new vision of the future while preserving its historic and artistic links to the past. And no doubt its reconstruction will still be debated, as is the French cultural tradition. I think the story of the cathedral is still being written. In fact, they still have some restoration to do, and it will continue even though it is now open. And we will let Victor Hugo have the last word. There is nothing like a dream to create the future. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was wonderful and enlightening and really inspiring to listen to. And at this point, I want to open things up to our live stream and to begin the Q&A portion of our program. So again, as always, I encourage those of you watching live to continue to pose your questions that you might have for Kathy about the cathedral in the Hopkins home chat. And we will then do our best to respond to as many questions as we can in the time that we have. So let me just pivot and let me pose first. I have some questions, Kathy, which I'm curious to ask you myself as a historian and medievalist, but I want to start with Cindy asks, how unique is the design of Notre-Dame Cathedral compared maybe to others? Because the design does seem really distinct and instantly identifiable. Can you talk about that?
Well, I can only talk about it in reference to other cathedrals in Paris. I haven't seen that many outside of Paris, and it is unique. And it is pretty much in the center of Paris. A lot of this was medieval. As I said, there was no architect. It was stonemasons, and it was the brilliant idea of Bishop du Sully. I really can't comment that much further. He wanted it to be the center of Paris and put Paris on the map for creating something like this.
Great. Well, sort of pivoting then from that and sort of thinking about and looking at your spectacular cover, thinking about what is so distinctive about Notre Dame, and Barry asked, was there anything truly and irrevocably lost in the fire?
I think that I'm not totally up to date. I'm already, the book is from right after the fire, so it's 5 years old. And I think there were things that were lost. I don't have a list of them. I'm already on to researching a new book, so I can't tell you what was lost. There were things that were melted and needed to be replaced, and perhaps it's in some of the articles that have been recently written.
Yeah, and I might chime in just a little and say, as a medievalist, I know in some of what I've seen that the timbers of the roof, right, when the roof burns, I mean, those, such as it were, are irreplaceable. They're gone. They worked hard to reconstruct them, as you said so well. They had all these different options, but they worked hard to reconstruct them as they were in this medieval fashion.
They did put in some kind of fire, which they didn't noted. They didn't know there was a they didn't have any kind of smoke signal that there was a fire, and they did put in some kind of smoke signal now to alert people to a fire. And that brings up another sort of interesting point. They don't know who started the fire or how it started, whether it was an electrical short or it was a worker doing renovation who dropped a cigarette butt. I have an architect friend he's French, and he and another friend of mine who is also French think it was a workman's cigarette butt, but they will never know.
So we have another question, Kathy, from Amelie, I think, asking if you can talk a little bit about the similarities or differences between Notre Dame and, say, Westminster Abbey in London, because they're both, these central anchor points for these capital cities, medieval and modern cities now. They both have very similar features, the kind of round apse in the back and the way in which the buttresses kind of fly off in such a distinctive and evocative way.
The buttresses were definitely a medieval invention. I really can't talk about that because I don't know Westminster Abbey very well. And I researched the construction of Notre Dame, but that was the cathedral that I did.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that.
And then Barry also asks a follow-up. Are there similar alerts, being installed in other churches or cathedrals, or maybe other buildings that you've looked at in the many buildings that you've written about that are these kind of, in the case of Paris, national monuments or treasures at the very least?
I would think so, but I don't know the answer to that either. I'm sorry. I haven't delved into that information.
Sure. Um, I'm curious, Kathy, do you have plans to get back to the building to see it, particularly in the inside? I mean, as a French historian, I am often asked in these last couple of weeks, is it going to look the same? What do you think? What do you think it looks like? So I'd love to hear you speculate on
I
that.
have seen spectacular pictures of the interior. And they've been on television, they've been in the newspapers. They're quite stunning. Look online. I was in Paris during Thanksgiving this year, and we did go wander around Notre Dame. there were so many people. You do have to, if you want to go inside, it's best to go online and make a reservation. It was not open yet, so I did not see the interior. And over the years, I usually spend a month in Paris every year since writing the books. I usually avoid Notre Dame because it's so crowded. But next year when I'm there in September, probably, I will probably go inside again. But I've seen pictures and it just looks spectacular and new and not dusty and grimy the way a lot of old medieval structures look like on the inside.
Great. Well, with that in mind, and sort of the ways in which we kind of fall in love with a certain aesthetic of Notre Dame, and you did such a wonderful job describing Viollet-le-Duc's impact on the building and on our imaginary, really, from the 19th century about how the building looks and feels through to this day. Marguerite asks, what do you think if Viollet-le-Duc were still alive today? Because you mentioned that, right? What might he have done to modernize it, if you can speculate?
I don't know that he would have used, they went back into the forest and that's what they called the top portion where the spire is and the attic. It was something like 1,000 pieces brand wood, and they did replace it exactly as it was. I think he would have used more modern material and maybe fireproof material. It's just speculation, but he was such an innovator, but still true to the sense of medieval architecture, that I think he would have tried to do something different, a little different. I mean, obviously kept the Western facade, but he made the spire taller than the original one. He added the statuary. He shored up the buttresses. They were there. They're part of medieval architecture, but who knows? It's pure speculation.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question because, of course, in the 19th century with the Tour Eiffel and the train station that now houses the Musée d'Orsay, as well as the rebuilding of the Hotel de Ville, right? They used metal to do that, right? Sort of a combination of steel and iron and whatnot. And it certainly would have been more fireproof than the forest that was up there to some extent. So
I think he would have done some modernization, but still be true to the spirit of Gothic engineering.
Right. Well, another question asking you about the building, Pierre asks, can you share more about the role of the stained glass windows in the history of storytelling, in its history and its storytelling?
I'm not that up to date on that. Maybe can you answer that, Anne? You may.
A little bit. I mean, I can say a little bit. The stained glass windows in Notre-Dame evolve in various ways. The round one, you showed such a beautiful slide of the west facade, which we can see on the cover of your book, which is colored glass, and then the two windows on the north and south transept with colored glass to depict, I think, saints as well as the Virgin Mary, and I think Mary maybe it could be Anne and Mary, or Mary holding the Christ child. It's been a long time since I've looked specifically at the program. But I think there also might be a representation of the personification of wisdom, because Notre Dame was the focal point of the University of Paris. And so that was a very important set of images in the Middle Ages for them to think with and think about. But I know, just to draw a medieval contrast, the glass in Notre Dame certainly has a program, but it's not as fully developed and oriented around storytelling as, for example, the glass in the Sainte-Chapelle, the royal chapel that Louis IX builds basically to house and hold the crown of thorns as a kind of reliquary you can walk inside. And that stained glass tells all kinds of stories about from the Old Testament, the New Testament, and about the relics themselves.
And it's stunning to see on a sunny day at Sainte-Chapelle because the stained glass is so beautiful. It will be interesting since they had to do some little bit of repair and clean up on these stained glasses, how they look from the inside.
Yeah, fascinating. Well, we have a nice technical question drawing on some of other aspects of expertise at Hopkins. So Wu wonders if, Kathy, you know much about the work in repairing the building that leads to new knowledge or a rebirth of traditional techniques. Thinking here about examples from engineering. And there's, for example, Professor Thomas Gurney of civil engineering at JHU who studies fire damage. And it seems like really in his wheelhouse, as well as the wheelhouse of other civil engineers. Are there things that we learned from the fire that you could speculate about?
Only what they unearthed because I'm not an engineer, and the article that was in the New York Times goes into some of the work that the workmen did. This was to be kind of a history of going back through the centuries, and I'm not totally up to date on all the reconstruction.
Yeah, and I think there's that tension, right, of certain people around, maybe Macron and those who chose to do a kind of more traditional approach versus kind of, again, the new techniques that you were talking about that maybe were not adopted in quite the same way. I think I did see that they put a sprinkler system in, though, around the
Yes.
wood. Yeah, and that seems like, oh yes, that's a good idea. You know, they learned from all
And
of
Viollet-le-Duc probably would have done that as well.
Indeed, indeed. Well, Kathy, I'm so curious, both about, maybe this is sort of a twin question, given the books that you've written, but about Notre-Dame first, and then maybe Paris more broadly. Do you have, you personally, since you've studied this for so intensively for so long, a favorite aspect about the building or a favorite part about the building that you tell people about or like to go back to? And I guess the twin of that is there a favorite building, historical building, maybe in Paris that you always visit when you go back?
Well, I love the western facade of Notre Dame. And when you are up at a height that you can look out and see Sacré-Cœur from a distance. In fact, I think one of the slides they show up on there. But I shouldn't say I love what the revolutionaries did, but I do because I think those stories are so interesting. And so another reason why I like the Gallery of the Kings and the Western facade. Um, I it sounds cliche-ish, but I love the Eiffel Tower. Something that's made of so many metal parts. Um, it's so graceful, and it was only supposed to last for 20 years. And Monsieur Eiffel had a very clever way of keeping it around, and it's now, the most iconic thing next to maybe Notre Dame. Um, uh, that is recognizable in Paris. There are a number of other buildings that I like around Paris. I love. Some of them are not very well known. They're just in like warehouse sections, and I think they're really interesting. Um, but Musée d'Orsay is a stunning, stunning building. I try to go there every time. It's super crowded also, but I try to go see an exhibit there every time I'm in Paris. Um, and the Grand Palais is a fabulous museum. Well, it's an exhibition space now.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, and Marguerite asks another question, kind of building on what we've been talking about, and your comment about the fact that in the medieval period there was no architect that we can point to, no plans that they, looked at to execute. So, in that sense, who is responsible? Could you say a little more about how the design of the building kind of came into effect? Again, speculating as medievalists do.
I'm sorry to say I'm not totally up to date on that. It was the brainchild of Maurice de Sully, and I'm sure there were a lot of various people involved in it, um, commissions and but I don't know who off the top of my head. As I said, I wrote it 5 years ago. I myself will have to reread it. Um, and I don't, there was probably a project manager or the equivalent of a project manager.
Great. So maybe two final wrap-up questions. One for folks who have never been, and Jensen asked this, what do you feel when you're standing inside Notre Dame? Can you kind of evoke some of that for folks?
Well, it's awesome. I mean, it's just awesome. And the fact that it played such an important role, not just religiously, but in cultural life, is also awesome. I mean, you don't have to go inside to, there is a park behind it, and it, you see it from all different angles. You can walk all the way around it. When the fire happened, you couldn't get close. They closed off blocks and blocks. You just could not get close to it. But you don't even have to go inside to feel the awesomeness of it. Um, Although I am curious because the renovation from the photos and the images I've seen looks spectacular and very clean.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think the building will kind of sparkle, as I tell people, literally, because the walls seem much brighter, and the gold paint that they've used on the arches and the columns, I think it's going to be quite spectacular. Well, thank you so much for that. Maybe as a final parting thought for people both who've been and those who haven't, would you share with us other than your fantastic book with its illustrations, would you share with us a book and or movie that you would recommend about Notre Dame, perhaps Victor Hugo, or maybe something
Definitely,
more?
definitely Victor Hugo's book. The characters, I actually have never watched the movie. I think there's a very old movie. But the book, I was thoroughly engrossed in Victor Hugo's Notre-Dame de Paris. It's probably come out with the title The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but his original title was just simply Notre-Dame de Paris. And it's very engrossing.
Wonderful. Wonderful, great. Well, I think we are out of questions and just about out of time. So thank you for that answer and for your answers to the questions, and indeed for the talk. So I just want to thank you, Kathy, for taking time to speak with us today and for this timely discussion about Notre Dame. And I want to thank everyone else who tuned in to listen to our conversation this evening. We hope that you will join us for other free public virtual lectures like this one in the rest of December and in the new year. To do so, visit hopkinsathome.jhu.edu for more events, and there's a library of recorded content there, so you can check that out as well. So just leaves me to say thank you, and I hope you all have a wonderful night.